Good evening, attendees of this last Reset webinar with the distinguished Professor Ross Garnaut. Thus far, we have had 5 insightful and thought-provoking lectures. I expect no less of tonight's lecture. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Please join me in welcoming our deans, deputy deans, our business and economics board members, alumni council members, and young alumni committee members. As tonight is the last of the series, Ross has kindly agreed to extend the talk by 30 minutes, permitting you to ask questions on any of the topics Ross has covered over the last 6 weeks. Ross has eloquently covered topics such as what is needed to restore Australia to prosperity and how we should pursue policies that enable us to do better than the period known as the dog days. It was on matters pertaining to energy and energy-intensive manufacturing. Tonight's lecture is focusing on the importance of free trade and international cooperation on matters pertaining to economics and security. Professor Ross Garnaut is highly regarded in Australia for the roles he has played to influence economic policy and international relations. Ross's long-standing career has encompassed a range of positions that have included policy advisor, diplomat, and businessman. I am delighted to call him my colleague at the Melbourne Institute. When it comes to being an expert on international relations, Ross has held many positions that have enabled him to utilize his existing and further deepen his expertise. Key positions have included serving as a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and serving as Australia's ambassador to China. He has also served on internationally based boards for numerous nonprofit and for-profit organizations. Please welcome Professor Ross Garnaut.
Thank you, Abigail, and welcome again for those who've stuck with us over the last 6 weeks. Remember Albert Camus in the first lecture. Plagues, wars, and recessions are so common, and yet they always take us by surprise. So stupid that they can't last. And yet they last. This evening I start with war. I then go on to international cooperation affecting the economy, health and climate. About a quarter of a century ago, Des Ball, Professor of Strategic Studies, organised Nancy Viviani, Professor of International Relations, and me to meet regularly for a while in the bushy beer garden at the ANU's University House. The 3 of us started to plan a book on economics and security. We were all busy on many things, and that book was one that wasn't written. A pity, because we need it now, and Des is not around with his unique insights. The pandemic and recession have increased tensions between China and some developed democratic capitalist countries. The most important tension has been between the United States and China. A new coronavirus could have developed in any one of many countries. It happened to emerge in the city of Wuhan in Hubei province in China. The Chinese leadership took over a month to acknowledge the dangers of the virus and to act decisively to contain it. Would other countries have been faster in honest recognition of the problem and effective response? Probably yes for some and no for others. The lapsed time allowed the transmission of the disease more widely through China and beyond than it would have done with immediate action. That was costly for China and the world. It is important now for all of the substantial countries of the world, including China, to work together through the WHO to make sure that the next global public health threat is managed promptly and well. Some governments acted decisively and effectively to knowledge when it became available in late January. Those included governments in South Korea and Taiwan, where there was early and intense exposure, but in which effective action avoided major health impacts. Australia and New Zealand had longer to respond, and when the time came, did so in a timely and effective way. Some countries responded slowly and incoherently to evidence of the disease. The US is suffering the consequences of its government's inadequate response. This is part of the background to intensification of tensions in contemporary Sino-American political relations. There is deeper background. As Henley Bull would have told us, and Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd did, the rise of new great powers and the destabilising impact of this on existing patterns of power is familiar in the history of relations among states. The Thucydides trap has become a cliche, but is no less important, nor true for that. What matters is how these disruptions are managed, especially in an age of nuclear weapons and globalisation of human activities. Good management starts with knowledge and analysis. Tensions in US relations with China probe neuralgic tissue in the Australian body politic. The choice between post-pandemic restoration and post-pandemic dog days tangles with complex issues that arise from the shift of the centre of gravity of global economic growth towards our own Western Pacific region. It tangles with the complexities of our alliance at a time in the US of uncertainty about values and institutions, political tension, and policy incoherence. These are larger issues that I do not seek to illuminate in this lecture. But in telling the post-pandemic economic story, I cannot avoid reference to the security dimensions of the Sino-American and Sino-Australian relationships that have placed Australia awkwardly with its major trading partner. There is talk of decoupling supply chains, of trade diversification, of reducing dependence, of sovereign self-sufficiency, and talk about a new Cold War. The old Cold War lasted for several decades and ended several decades ago. It could have been a hot war fought with nuclear weapons. The US and the Soviet Union each controlled nuclear arsenals capable of destroying all of the cities of the world. Such an exchange would have sent humanity into a miserable dark age. Maybe worse, a dark age envisages an eventual enlightenment. Whilst it was a great achievement to avoid a hot war between the great powers, the US and the Soviet Union fought indirect wars with conventional weapons in the Middle East, Africa, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America. These conflicts brought great misery to people in many countries. It is a great mercy for human civilization that the misery did not include the fallout from direct war between the US and the Soviet Union. It is a great mercy that neither the US nor the Soviet Union ever used nuclear weapons in the indirect wars. It is a great mercy for Australia that our participation in indirect wars never involved military conflict on Australian soil. The avoidance of hot war was a triumph for knowledge and analysis. Knowledge and analysis in the minds of a few dozen highly intelligent people over 2 generations. Disciplined minds, committed to visions of national and to some extent international interest. Very different visions, but grounded in a disciplined view of their national interests. Good minds in the right offices, mostly in Washington and Moscow. A few in Boston, New York, London, and Canberra. The US president, who is personally most deeply steeped in the essential Cold War strategic knowledge and analysis, wrote in 2012, quote, Desmond Ball's counsel and cautionary advice based on deep research made a great difference to our collective goal of avoiding nuclear war. His work demonstrated the degree of wishful thinking behind concepts of controlled nuclear escalation. Wishful thinking. That's why war is so common. It always takes us by surprise. Too stupid to last, and yet it lasts. I participated in the serious Cold War discussion only around the edges, but was close enough to recognize the quality of knowledge and analysis. Prime Minister Bob Hawke put great effort and intellect into understanding the role that Australia played in the US global strategic system. The intelligence institutions at Northwest Cape and Pine Gap made us an early target in any nuclear exchange. This was not to be accepted lightly. Knowledge and analysis revealed that our role in nuclear deterrence was important to the stability of Cold War relationships, including through contributions to verification for arms control agreements. Our contribution to peace made the awful risk of nuclear annihilation one that we should take in full knowledge of its implications. This perspective was shared with the Australian community by the Prime Minister and his Defence and Foreign Affairs Ministers. This all comes to mind when I hear talk of a new Cold War. Easy talk. Talk by people who reveal few signs of understanding the old Cold War or the contemporary strategic realities. Does the current General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and the people in the system, advice and restraint around him have the knowledge and analytic capacity and national interest intent of their counterparts in Moscow in the decades of the old Cold War? Do the current President of the United States and the people around him have the knowledge and analytic capacity and national interest intent of the US presidents and their intimate advisors through the long decades of the old Cold War? Do the prominent exponents of strategic policy and studies in Canberra today have the capacity of their counterparts 2 and 3 generations ago? Wishful thinking and Cold War are dangerous partners. Wishful thinking is why wars are so common and yet take us by surprise, why they are too stupid to last and yet they last. Wishful thinking is the antithesis of knowledge and analysis. Security will be found in knowledge and analysis, or it won't be found at all. A country's security from military coercion depends on many things. These include the quality of its military capacity. They include the quality of its diplomacy and whether it is able to project itself as being helpful to other countries' prosperity and security and general well-being. The latter is Joseph Nye's concept of soft power. Capacity to project both hard and soft power depend on economic size. A country can choose to maintain military capacity that is disproportionately larger than its economic size for some time by raising its military expenditure. This comes at the cost of future economic size and therefore future military as well as soft power capacity. The Soviet Union through the Cold War, North Korea ever since the silence of the guns on the peninsula, and Pakistan through its long strategic rivalry with India are extreme examples of countries that chose to project military power out of proportion to their economic size at the cost of longer-term economic development and therefore military and soft power capacity. Post-war Britain is a less extreme example of the same phenomenon. Military security in the short term is to some extent a zero-sum game. One country grows stronger means the other's position is weaker, although the calculations are more complex in a multi-country world of shifting alliances. Trade and economic relations among states, on the other hand, are unambiguously positive-sum gains. One country's prosperity tends to make others more prosperous. Open trade benefits all countries that participate in it. Protection and closure of trade hurt most the country that takes the initiative, and others as well. The gains of open trade are not spread evenly across the world. Countries with smaller economies and with economic capacities that are most different from others benefit disproportionately from open trade. Australia benefits more than others from open trade on both counts, and loses disproportionately from our own or other countries' trade protection. Knowledge and analysis lead a country in Australia's position to be wary of using zero-sum calculations in formulating strategic policy. Restricting economic exchange may weaken one's opponent, but weakens more one's own economy and society. The national interest is secured not by avoiding global interaction, but by avoiding conflict that serves no national purpose. Conflict is avoided through well-judged military deterrence, including through alliances that reflect the interests of all members. Strong diplomacy and other exercise of soft power, and the nurturing of mutually beneficial trade and economic relations. There are some strategic interests that require restrictions on trade and investment. Knowledge and analysis can define these precisely in ways that acknowledge the positive sum game of international economic exchange. If we are clear in identifying and following our essential security interests, we can avoid restriction on economic exchange that has substantial economic value and little security cost. We can preserve more of our prosperity. Because a stronger economy is important for security, this strengthens security as well. Well, now I'll say a little bit about the effects of the pandemic recession on economic and strategic weight across the world. The pandemic and recession have imposed great economic costs on every country. The pandemic itself is now heavily concentrated in the developing world. The momentum of global development was maintained after the global financial crisis disrupted the developed economies. For the most part, developing countries kept growing quite strong rates, on average not much below the 8 years leading up to the global financial crisis. But the momentum of global development has been broken by the pandemic recession. I'll put up two charts now that update something we presented in the first lecture 5 weeks ago. That's the black vertical line, lecture 1. And I've updated that to yesterday. These are the total deaths from the coronavirus for the world as a whole. They reached a peak in the middle of April, then fell steadily. They've been rising again since the second week of June. You can see 4 colors on the chart. The blue is China, where the pandemic began. A big peak, tiny compared with what happened in other countries later, but big for China and the world at the time, that had receded by the end of March. From that time, the virus took hold in, first of all, in continental Europe, and that's the green, reaching a peak, easing back until by June, it was at moderate levels. The center of gravity of the pandemic then shifted to what I call Anglo-North Atlantic, the US, UK, and Canada, which suffered unusually badly. If we can just go back to the first one for a moment. That reached a peak after Europe, that's the orange, reaching a peak after the green Europe, and it hasn't come down to anything like the low levels that Europe's attained. And sadly, there are signs that it may be taking off again. The average for Anglo-North Atlantic is an average of some regions, notably New York and New Jersey in the United States, where the peak was very high and where it's come down to very low levels, and other parts of the United States where it's accelerating, and we all fear may get much worse yet. The big story is the red, other developing countries, which are now clearly the center of gravity of the pandemic, to an extent that wasn't there even when I first presented a version of this chart in lecture 1. Comparison between the 3 regions becomes clearer in the next chart, chart 6.2. This overlays the separate regions, and you can see there that the red, other developing countries, is continuing to accelerate, now at a peak much larger than Europe or Anglo North Atlantic. Still, of course, very high levels of deaths in the United States, but everything is overwhelmed by what's happening in the developing world now. We should qualify even those difficult statistics with the note that the underestimate of deaths is underestimates everywhere, but the underestimates of COVID-related deaths are undoubtedly much greater in the developing world, where public health facilities are poorer and less able to measure precisely what is due to the pandemic. Developing countries have weak public health systems with which to respond to the pandemic. They have fragile financial systems, vulnerable to flight of capital and downgrading of international investors' appetite for risk. They have shallow fiscal and monetary policy capacity with which to counteract recessionary pressures. They share with Australia exposure to the lower commodity prices that accompany global recession. The economic setback in our neighbours in the developing world is, for Australia, the most consequential of all the geopolitical consequences of the pandemic recession. Our potential economic and strategic partners in South and Southeast Asia, most importantly India and Indonesia, will be able to carry this weight. Our neighbours across our northern sea boundaries require more intelligent support than we have the mind to contemplate. Now, coming back to globalization, global supply chains, and sovereign self-sufficiency. Half a century ago, last month, I was in a crowded common room at the Australian National University with visiting Canadian rock star Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Canada produces most of the world's nickel, proclaimed a well-informed young man. Why do you allow it just to be exported? Trudeau grinned. What do you want us to do with it? He said. Put it in our pockets. There is talk today that COVID-19 has made a case for sovereign self-reliance and for breaking up international supply chains that have links to China. It's important that we apply knowledge and analysis to loose talk before any action emerges from it. Supply chains into and out of China have not been disrupted more than other international trading relationships. It was briefly difficult to receive some products and materials during the China lockdown. This was not amongst the more important economic disruptions of the pandemic. The world's most important manufacturing supply chains start with Australian iron ore moving into China. That trade has actually expanded, with COVID-induced reduction in supply from Australia's main competitor, Brazil. The talk itself reduces others' confidence in the reliability of international trade. I was ambassador to China in the early years of China's reform of Maoist autarky. An important part of my job was to explain to leaders of government and business that international trade was a cost-effective and reliable way for China to secure goods and services that were necessary for development. Maoist doctrine favoured self-reliance for security reasons. Doctrine had been reinforced by experience. The US blocked trade with China from the early 1950s. When I presented my credentials to the president in 1985, Li Shenyan said that he greatly appreciated Australia's supply of wheat through the Great Famine of the early 1960s, in contradiction of US trade restrictions. We engaged comprehensively with Chinese leaders on how reliance on international markets would improve the chances of China realizing its high ambitions for economic development. We focused at first on the advantages to China in moving away from self-reliance in food, steelmaking raw materials, and textile fibers. When interviewed by the Shanghai World Economic Herald to mark the 15th anniversary of diplomatic relations in December 1987, I was asked whether Chinese leaders could succeed in their ambitions for self-sufficiency in food. Yes, I replied. All that is necessary is for the reforms to fail and for the Chinese people to remain poor. But if the reforms succeed and the Chinese people on the mainland grow rich like their compatriots in Hong Kong and Taiwan, it will not be possible to provide all of the high-quality food that 20% of the world's people want from 7% of the world's good agricultural land. My comments were accurately reported in the paper. I was invited to discuss the article over lunch in the Great Hall of the People by Du Runsheng, venerable advisor on agricultural reform to Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang at the apex of party and state. Du brought along as interpreter a recent graduate in agricultural economics from the University of Chicago, Justin Lin. Justin was later founder of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University and World Bank Senior Vice President and Chief Economist. By the mid-1990s, official statements were saying that import of 5% of grain consumption was acceptable. That was more than the Australian wheat crop in a good year. China's imports of food are now so large that, by the account of a former national security advisor, an American president believes that variations in the amount can swing elections in US Midwest farm states. Australia's efforts in persuasion were more emphatically successful with iron and steel and wool. I said in a lecture at the Wuhan Iron and Steel University in January 1988 that China would get much more value from its steel mills if they used high-quality imported iron ore. China would benefit, I said, from importing 100 million tons of high-quality iron ore by the end of the century. A couple of weeks later, Premier Li Peng in Beijing was quoted by the Xinhua news agency. Quote, "Some foreigners say that China will import 100 million tons of iron ore by the end of the century, but they don't understand the Chinese situation." That was the Premier in response to my public lecture. Last year, China accounted for most of the world's imports of iron ore, 1.09 billion tons, with almost 2/3 coming from Australia. On wool, imports of fine fibre would enable China to produce high-quality fabrics for export markets and for an increasingly prosperous and demanding domestic population. From small levels then, China came to buy 3/4 of the Australian wool clip. Leaders of the metallurgy industry eventually became comfortable about our iron ore story, but cautioned against pushing coal. That was a bridge too far. Autarkic attitudes were too deeply established. China had plenty of metallurgical and thermal coal, even if not all was as high quality as the best Australian. We persisted anyway. In 2018, before the recent deterioration in Sino-Australian relations, China was Australia's largest market for coal, including for metallurgical coal. Those unlikely gains for coal a long time ago are being corroded by recent developments in our relationship with China. Substantial exclusion from the Chinese market is likely to keep Australian coal jobs in decline. China's confidence in global markets continued to expand for over 3 decades after my time in Beijing. It was enhanced by entry into the WTO in 2001, itself an outcome from long-term Sino-Australian cooperation. Australian exports of high-value services and food have been greatly enhanced by Chinese implementation of the bilateral free trade agreement. China's own objectives in the free trade agreement were heavily weighted towards investment. As Chinese implementation of the FTA has diversified and expanded Australian exports, we have increased restrictions on Chinese investment. Many Australians expect China to honour its obligations under the free trade agreement at the same time as they expect Chinese to understand and not to mind at all when we, for our own good reasons, dishonour our own commitments. Knowledge and analysis are built of sterner stuff. Sound strategic analysis begins with understanding how our words and deeds sound and look to others. Let's identify clearly those areas in which it is not in Australia's interest to have open international exchange, recognising that our own restriction has consequences in others' perceptions of the reliability of trade with us. Let's specify those matters clearly. Let's make clear the limits of restrictions. If continuing analysis changes the boundaries of what is in Australia's interest, let's be prompt and clear in defining new boundaries. For example, there is such a thing as critical infrastructure, which we should want to be under the control of Australians with unambiguous commitment to the Australian public interest. Let's define clearly what is critical infrastructure. If it is truly critical infrastructure in an era of corporations without frontiers and of cyber vulnerability, it is wishful thinking to presume a Manichaean world in which it matters not who owns critical infrastructure so long as it is not Chinese. Let's not run away from hard questions. Would knowledge and analysis lead us towards resumption of Australian state ownership? I expect that our knowledge and analysis will identify relatively few areas where open trade is against the national interest. Be that as it may, let's find them through transparent analysis, explain them clearly, and act decisively. Words are bullets in the political economy of trade policy. Let's only fire when knowledge and analysis shows that there is good reason. And let's make sure that any shots hit their marks and avoid collateral damage, including to Australians. Like it or not, we live in a global economy and society. The solutions to our most consequential problems require cooperation, at least amongst all major countries. Most solutions depend most on the US and China, but not only on them. Emergence from recession everywhere will be supported by concerted fiscal and monetary expansion. Such support was present during and after the global financial crisis. The formation in late 2008 of the G20 as a heads of government forum with Australia as a member was an important step. Concerted economic expansion without explicit understandings among states is possible, but unlikely on the required scale. The appropriate forum is again the G20. It is not some ad hoc group selected by the President of the United States, which excludes authoritarian China and brings authoritarian Russia in from the cold. China, after all, was by far the largest contributor to global economic expansion out of the GFC, first announced at a G20 meeting in November 2008. Post-pandemic economic development requires an open multilateral trading system. The system around the WTO is imperfect, but has supported trade expansion and broadly based economic growth on a global scale. Australia has been one of the largest beneficiaries of its work. China has met its WTO obligations as well as others on issues that matter to Australia, including on disputes resolution. We can be disappointed that China did not go further than meet its minimal obligations at a time when the WTO needed new sources of leadership on open trade. That is a separate matter. Over the past few years, the WTO has been marginalised by US unilateral discriminatory protectionism and crippled by the US blocking appointments to the disputes resolution mechanism, the appellate body. Without a change in US president, we can only and must seek to replicate WTO mechanisms in smaller groups, as has happened with the establishment of a dispute settlement mechanism outside the WTO. The international community found an effective instrument for climate change mitigation with the Paris Agreement in December 2015. Cooperation between the presidents of the US and China played an essential role in formulation and early implementation of the Paris Agreement. Since then, President Trump has initiated a process of early withdrawal that will come into effect about the time of the November presidential election. President Xi has moved away from implementation of policies that were delivering overperformance against China's commitments. Restoration of the post-Paris momentum would contribute to post-pandemic global economic development. It will be especially helpful for Australia, assisting the emergence of low emissions export industries in energy-intensive goods and allowing carbon credits. Absent restoration of US participation and restoration of momentum in the Paris Agreement, there is high probability that incoherent responses to growing damage from climate change will disrupt post-pandemic development through the 2020s. COVID-19 is one of several epidemics with potential to disrupt global development that have emerged so far this century. The World Health Organization has been instrumental in sharing information on and developing responses to epidemics across countries. The World Health Organization's role has been valuable in developing countries with weak public health systems. Valuable, but inadequate to the urgency of the problem as it emerged in January 2020 and to the scale of the problem that has now developed. Strengthening of the organisation and augmentation of resources is necessary. The successful European resolution, supported by Australia on investigation of the origins and evolution of the COVID crisis, will help to establish a foundation for reform. Again, the position of the US under President Trump is an impediment to effective global action. Other developed countries and China will need to carry larger shares of a heavier load, pending US re-engagement under a president more positively disposed to international cooperation. The most immediate post-pandemic challenge to the international community is the stabilization of developing economies that have been disrupted by disease and its recessionary aftermath. This is a task for the established global institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. They can only be successful if supported by the whole range of regional organizations and bilateral donors in their spheres of interest. The new Chinese international development institutions can play large and positive roles. Demands on Australia in its immediate neighbourhood will be heavy. The international community is poorly equipped to handle the great challenge. An historic rupture of global development is likely, with large negative effects on political stability and economic growth everywhere. President Trump crops up as a recurring element in contemporary problems of international cooperation. Personalities matter, and a change of president in November, if it were to happen, would expand what is possible in dealing with global challenges. But personalities are not all that matters. Trump's election 4 years ago reflects underlying problems that will not go away with a change of leadership in Washington. There is less easy acceptance now than a generation ago of deep integration into an international economy. There is, in the democratic developed countries, unease about increasing international trade, investment, and movement of people. We in Australia are not immune to the distrust of globalisation, although the long economic expansion and some features of our political culture, although the pandemic recession after the long economic expansion will test it. The limits of our immunity to the global disease of distrust of globalisation will be tested by high unemployment and the fall in ordinary Australians' incomes through the pandemic recession. We can improve the prospects for the most important international cooperation by heeding lessons about what has worked and what has generated the most powerful negative reactions in recent decades. Voluntary cooperation has often produced better results than attempts to reach and to implement binding legal agreements. This is true of trade policy. The voluntary cooperation based on intimate exchange of information within Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in the first decade from APEC's formation in 1989 saw much more progress on trade liberalisation than the formal so-called free trade agreements that followed from the beginning of the 21st century. The successful modus operandi was concerted unilateral liberalisation. The Paris Agreement on climate change, built on concerted unilateral mitigation, is much more promising than the Kyoto approach embodying legally binding agreements. The successful G20 interventions for economic recovery from the global financial crisis were exercises in concerted unilateral expansion. The cooperative efforts on Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, climate change, and macroeconomic expansion were concerted because many countries were agreeing to move in the same direction at once. The knowledge that others were moving in that direction made it possible for each country to go further. The fact that cooperation did not involve a government binding itself to an international agreement allowed each domestic polity to judge proposals for cooperation on their substantive merits without being overwhelmed by reaction against powerful foreign forces. In all of these cases, concerted unilateral cooperation was built on expansion of trust and knowledge through the exchange of information and analysis. The role of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council in Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, of the International Panel on Climate Change in climate change mitigation, and of the OECD and IMF in cooperation on macroeconomic stabilization. Progress in this way is possible whenever cooperation involves a positive sum game. Most international cooperation has this characteristic, although it's not always immediately obvious to everyone. Concerted unilateral cooperation is the promising way forward in cooperation on health. Countries that do not wish to be part of the global effort can sit it out for a while and be encouraged back by progress others are making. Concerted unilateral cooperation is the way in which the international community may be able to get closer to making the huge transfers required to stabilize developing economies after the pandemic recession. Each country will be more active in areas of its greatest economic, political, and strategic interests. China and the core countries of Belt and Road, the European Union in Africa, Australia and the arc across our north. Military security is closer to being a zero-sum game, although further away than is often presumed. That makes explicit and binding and verifiable agreements more important in successful cooperation there. Australia has built its post-pandemic restoration, has to build its post-pandemic restoration in the most challenging international environment for almost a century. It greatly increases the difficulty of the task and the chances that we will fail. It increases the importance of getting right everything that is in Australia's own control. Australia's task has been greatly complicated by the Trump administration's retreat from participation in established global cooperative arrangements on macroeconomic policy, trade, development, health, and climate. The challenge is complicated by China under Xi Jinping being more assertive in the projection of hard and soft power on and beyond its own borders. It's hugely complicated by the tensions between its largest security and trading partners. Doing everything right within our own control means being analytic and precise in defining our security interests where they conflict with trade. It means maintaining open trade, whatever others do. It means responding intelligently to what will be immense demands for maintaining political order and economic development in the small developing countries on our northern borders, and economic stability in our larger neighbours in Southeast Asia. It means being a full and active participant in the activities of the WTO, WHO, and the UNFCCC. Foreign Minister Marise Payne's speech last week expressed Australia's support for global cooperation and the institutions through which it can be achieved. Success in that effort is a necessary condition for Australia's post-pandemic restoration. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ross. We're now have some time for lots of questions. So while you probably catch a drink of water as you're doing right now, I will start with the first question. So the first question is, if we could acknowledge that Australia must act on its national interest on a wide range of issues, how do we define national interest?
Ultimately, that's a matter for each of us as citizens, and our views come together through a political process in our democracy, ultimately in the decisions of government. But I think we can draw a very clear distinction between thoughts about policy that pursue some general objective of the welfare of Australians and specific interests pursuing narrow objectives of their own. So the first part of the distinction that's important is that we do need to distinguish between vested interests and people who are clearly pursuing the interests of a narrow part of the polity, and people who profess at least to advance a broader interest of the welfare of Australians. Now, there are a very large number of things that most Australians would agree are in the interests of the country and all of its people. Rising incomes, high employment. Most would agree that it's better to not have extreme inequality in distribution of wealth, although there will be different views that have to be arbitrated in the political process about the extent of inequality that's desirable. Most Australians would agree that it's in the national interest that Australia is able to evolve politically through decisions of its own citizens rather than through coercion of foreigners. So I've given some elements of a decision process and some elements of ideas that can help us sort that out. Ultimately, we each have to form a judgment with the arbiter being a political process.
Yes, and obviously it's not only an issue of judgment, but an issue of measurement, both challenging.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the Chinese-Australian relationship. What's your opinion on how the current government is handling that relationship?
Well, that's a very difficult issue, and I think that on some issues it's handling them well, on some issues it's handling them clumsily. In my presentation tonight, I implicitly pointed out a number of areas in which there could be less clumsiness. If I made a generalization about it, I'd say that we need more clarity, analytic clarity, more precision, more transparency, so that our community and people in other countries can see clearly what our policy is. I think that when you have a lack of transparency in policy, it's very difficult to build national, broadly based national support for policies, and that affects the stability of policies. It's also difficult for other countries to understand the terms on which they can relate to Australia, and therefore it increases the cost of interacting with Australia, and that reduces trade and investment possibilities in all spheres, and not only in spheres in which we would like to restrict trade and investment on sound policy grounds. So there's a matter of immense difficulty. I think the biggest weakness, I think, is a lack of transparency and clarity in policy. And on the positive side, the government has avoided extremes of rhetoric that could have made things worse.
So certainly transparency in policy, strong evidence base, and discourse of ideas are always important, which makes your comments even more important. Okay, moving on to the next question. Let's talk about U.S. politics in China. It's been perceived that you've put a lot of emphasis on the outcome of the U.S. presidential election in November. But even with a Biden victory, will that reverse a broad shift towards a more hawkish U.S.-China policy, including decoupling? So can and should Australia distance itself from this policy beyond November?
Yeah, I think that a change of president will change some important things. I've interacted with members of Republican administrations as well as Democrat going back over many decades, and there's something special about this Republican presidency. The absence of knowledge and analysis in this area of policy, foreign policy, security policy, as well as in trade policy and others. So I think it would be a big step forward for the United States to go back to a normal US president who brings into government the best expertise of the country, which has the world's best expertise. That's been a tradition of US government, that presidents of both political persuasions, they bring in different people, but they're well qualified people of high intelligence who know a lot and who draw upon the wisdom of the country from both sides of partisan politics. Well, we haven't had this from this president. I think the absence makes a lot of things harder. So a change of president will make things better. But lots of things won't go away, and some of those issues relate generally to globalization. Some relate specifically to relations with China. On globalization, as Max Corden and I said in that article in the Australian Economic Review a couple of years ago about Trump policies, one problem the US has is that not having a strong social safety net like Europe, like Australia, there's no buffering of people whose jobs and lives are disrupted by trade expansion, the structural change that goes along with that. Well, I think with a Biden administration, we'd have real effort on broadening, strengthening the public health system, the social safety net more broadly. I think that will be very helpful to easing some of the trade tensions. Now, there's another set of tensions between the US and China, to which I alluded in tonight's presentation, that relate to broader strategic questions and the rivalry between a rising power and another. This has been analyzed closely for at least 3,000 years, since the City's analysis of Sparta's challenge to Athens. Regrettably, these circumstances historically have often led to war, more often than not led to war, but they don't. History also tells us they don't necessarily end in war. Knowledge and analysis tells us that the negative consequences of war in contemporary circumstances would be catastrophic. So once you get knowledge and analysis back into policy, you avoid some of the risks of catastrophic outcomes.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's continue on with the question about the U.S. One of our participants thinks that critical infrastructure includes our defense connections. And she is concerned with our dependence on the U.S. and open-ended spending on defense in this area. So she is interested in your thoughts on our reliance on the U.S. to support our defense strategies.
Well, I don't think that Australian defense can be based on single-mindedly on our alliance with the US. There are a whole lot of strategic circumstances in which Australia might find itself, in which our priorities may not coincide with US priorities. It's happened historically. A couple of times in history when we've sought to evoke the ANZUS alliance on our issues, the US has not thought they were ANZUS issues, and so it's simply not the case that we can rely on the US alliance alone. The last part of the question about open-ended defense spending, I think we have to. I think we're foolish if we don't apply the same discipline to defense expenditure as to other expenditures. Perhaps the most undisciplined expenditure, large expenditure that we've engaged in has been on submarines. Ordered a number of years ago. We should apply a similar discipline assessment of cost effectiveness on defence expenditure of others. There's been a bit of a tendency to see that as a special area in which economic analysis, financial analysis is not relevant. That's bad for our security, because a strong economy is good for our security.
Excellent. I'm going to continue on with our relationship with other countries. So if broadly, and this would be Australia and other developed countries, focus on addressing their own needs, given the economic crisis that has evolved because of the pandemic, should we be concerned that there's going to be a fall in supporting aid and supporting developing countries?
Yes, we should. And that's the message of today's lecture, that increasingly the pandemic, the disease that is being concentrated in developing countries, and what's happening in some big and globally important developing countries is catastrophic. Brazil, at the moment, the extreme case, one has to worry about a lot of other important developing countries.
Yeah, recently in the newspaper there were some articles expressing concern about Indonesia.
Yeah, yes, in Indonesia, been a very good series of public seminars about this, involving Australian and Indonesian academics on the situation in Indonesia, hosted by the ANU. That's worth catching up on that question. Yeah, this is a huge inflection point for global development. There's a serious risk that the healthy momentum of development in the developing world in the 21st century so far will be broken. And we focus on Brazil and India and the big developing countries, but there's a similar story in a lot of smaller countries as well. They're being hurt very badly by the pandemic within their own countries. They're being hurt greatly by the decline in world trade. They've been hurt greatly by the reduced tolerance for risk of international investors, which always involves a pulling back in times of international economic stress from investment in developing countries. The international community is not as well equipped to step in and provide assistance, development assistance, macroeconomic stabilization assistance, as in earlier extreme events. In the case of the East Asian crisis, there was a lot of international support, some of it not very well thought through, but a lot of good support. Australia was very important with billion-dollar commitments, and that was worth even more, worth a lot now, but worth even more in the late 90s than today. Billion-dollar packages to Indonesia, Korea, and Thailand, and a lot of support from other countries. That was easier because that crisis was concentrated in East Asia. This one's truly global. Lots of countries all over the world requiring support at once. And at a time when there's less capacity in the developed countries to provide support because of their own economic circumstances, and also because some developed countries, first of all the United States, are less willing to provide assistance through the international development agencies. I talked about this, the central agencies that need to provide a framework and a lead are the IMF and the World Bank. Well, they don't have the resources that they once had, and in these circumstances it's hard to see them being augmented. So for those development assistance reasons that were referred to in the question, and for broader reasons, this is a truly dangerous time for global development. And a dangerous time for global development is a dangerous time for all of us, because today the problems in a large part of the developing world are problems for everyone.
Right. So now this is going to lead to a question about the India-Chinese relationship. Do you think it is deteriorating? And if so, how do you think this will impact the world and Australia?
Well, I think we should keep a bit of perspective on the clash in the Himalayas. That's an old-fashioned border dispute. Now, the fact that it happens means that there has been a deterioration, because for a long time there wasn't a violent clash on the border. So the first part of the answer is yes, there has been a deterioration. Both countries have stepped back. Leadership of both countries recognise that it will be damaging to them at this time to have a major military confrontation. The clash that's happened and the deterioration in relations around that clash will have its own geostrategic consequences. There had been a tendency for Indian-Chinese cooperation to become richer for a period, and trade and investment relations were expanding rapidly. One can expect some cooling of that, and in the way of these things diminish productive economic relations, and you do some damage to both of the countries involved.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to move on to a question that harks back to your lectures 3 and 4. So how do you view the issue of income inequality in Australia? And more broadly, what measures, if any, would you promote to reduce inequality?
I think Abigail should answer that. A lot of the best work is done at the Melbourne Institute. So my opinion's not worth as much as Abigail's, but I like a strong emphasis on median income, and separately on employment. I think that those are two important measures of whether prosperity or its absence is broadly based through the society. So I'd focus first on those, but I'd suggest that Abigail gives a better answer.
Well, I will tell you that we've been doing some work around poverty, and one of the challenges when you measure, whether you're measuring inequality or you're measuring poverty, is that it's very easy to have a national standard, but then if you look across communities, there's a huge variation in those poverty rates. And some key correlates is employment, as you raise, as well as education, which you have raised in prior lectures. So those are both quite important. Okay, I'm gonna I'm going to go back to some questions from the first lecture because it's been 5 or 6 weeks and it's been in the news a little bit. So in the news about, we have job keeper, we have job seeker. And so, to some extent that has making us feel kind of okay in Australia. But, with restrictions lifting and talk about when job keeper and job seeker are going to end, what is this going to do for the overall welfare of Australians?
Well, I think it's quite right that we've had a big buffer from JobKeeper and JobSeeker. That is a huge injection of purchasing power into the economy, and especially concentrated amongst relatively low-income people, or people who would have been low-income people, who are inclined to spend it. If that was suddenly withdrawn in September, nothing was put in its place, we would fall over a cliff. We would have a huge rise in unemployment that would be cumulative as reduced demand brought people into unemployment who currently are employed. We'd be in very bad shape. And that's why in those early lectures, I think it was especially lecture 3, I talked about the need to fill the hole of in demand that would be associated with the ending of JobKeeper and JobSeeker with other public programs. Now, the more that they can be focused effectively on sustainable income-generating activities, the better. Demand is demand, and if you've got a $180 billion gap, and I talked about that sort of gap for next year in that lecture, then can be filled by continuing JobKeeper and JobSeeker, or it can be filled by a restructure of the social security system, using the fact that you have to have that sort of deficit for a while to pay for a transition to a better tax and social security system. In lecture 3, or in lecture 4, I talked about the advantages of moving from the standard old corporate income tax to a cash flow tax. That would cost the budget a lot of money in the early stages. It would be very good for economic efficiency, for demand growth, for employment, for long-term incomes growth. But it would cost the budget a lot of money in the first couple of years. Well, now is the time to do it. For those two very big reforms with very big positive effects on long-term incomes growth and equity that cost a lot at the beginning, we could fill that demand gap with those reforms. But if we don't do anything, and we end JobKeeper and JobSeeker, then we will have a collapse of demand, unemployment, the like of which you and I have not seen in our lifetimes.
Yes, unfortunately. So we're going to go back. So talking about taxes and systems, I'm going to go back to lecture 4. The question that was raised around a two-sided tax was proposed for the mining industry over the super profits discussion during the Red government, but turned down. So why would they accept something like that today?
I think I answered that on the...
You did!
on the written answers to questions. Just remind me about it.
Well, your first comment was that you didn't think that the mining industry would accept your proposal.
Yeah, and if you ask university professors, do you think there should be a big increase in tax on people earning over $150,000 a year? They might not think that's a great idea, but you don't make tax policy by asking taxpayers what they would like. Everyone would like zero. Now, what was special about the the campaign of the mining industry back then was that it was the most overt investment in changing policy that we've ever seen in Australian politics. It might have changed for the worse Australian democracy. In my book Dog Days, I compared that episode with the much larger increase in taxation that Malcolm Fraser introduced when he introduced the crude oil levy in the late 70s. It was effectively a tax rate that took away 100% of the extra income that the oil companies got from the rising world oil prices in the 70s. And I contrasted the rather mild industry reaction to that to the reaction to the Gillard government, well, first of all, the Rudd government, and then Gillard government's proposal. And Malcolm Fraser, this was a conversation just weeks before he died, he thought it was really interesting, the difference. He said, but in those days, big companies accepted that it was the Australian government's job to govern. They could have their opinions, but it wasn't their job to invest their wealth in trying to change policy and government. And he said, I just called in Chief Executive of BHP and Esso for a drink and told them what was going to happen, and they said they weren't happy about it, and that was the end of it. So there's been a big change in Australian political culture. And I think Australia's in all the developed countries, but Australia amongst them is in deep trouble if we can't change back our political culture unless we can have governments taking policy decisions in the public interest. We won't get to that situation. Again, there's a question I discussed at some length in the book Dog Days. We won't get into that position without what I call an independent centre of our polity playing a bigger role in discussion of policy. Policy's been dominated by policy discussion by vested interests in recent times. The situation is probably a little bit better now than a few years ago. Now, as I said briefly in the lecture a few weeks ago, there was an additional problem with the resource super tax. It had a couple of names. I think Julie Gillard gave it a different name from Kevin Rudd, but it wasn't the right tax. It was dropped on the community without any prior discussion of it, so no one really understood it. When there was an immediate negative reaction from the mining industry, and only then did the Secretary of the Treasury send a couple of Treasury officers down to talk to me about how they could rescue the situation. Well, I had to tell them that it was too late. You have to prepare an understanding of a big change like that in advance. But what was wrong with it is that it wasn't genuinely two-sided. It was two-sided in that you got a deduction for your expenditures at the same rate as the taxation on income, but you had to wait for that, and therefore you had to believe that governments in 10 or 20 years' time would be maintaining the same policies as existed now. It's only a truly two-sided tax if you get the offset against expenditure when you make the expenditure right now. Now, it's that characteristic of the cash flow tax which makes it expensive to introduce. You get more tax back later, but you give up tax when it's introduced. So the only time to introduce a truly two-sided tax like that is when it's a good thing to have a budget deficit because you're trying to get out of a deep recession.
So another question on energy. Should we allow companies to sell our resources or products cheaper overseas than locally? For example, gas prices.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea for governments to police prices in export markets. When I was Bob Hawke's economic advisor, I advised Bob Hawke to get rid of a system which we tried to do that because governments don't act. We used to do that in the 70s under the Whitlam and then Fraser governments, and Hawke got rid of it. Because governments don't really know what they're doing if they're trying to regulate the prices at which countries can export. In those days, in the Whitlam and Fraser days, any company wanting to export coal or aluminium or iron ore had to put a proposal to the Department of Trade who would say, yeah, the price is right or it's not. Okay. That just increases transactions costs in trade, introduces uncertainty. Talked a bit about that in tonight's lecture, Janet. But when you do find that your exports are selling more cheaply in other markets than they are at home, then you should think about what else is wrong. Now, that can only happen if you've got a monopoly at home, and we've got one. So that's the problem. Price regulation is not the answer. Making sure we've got competitive markets is the answer.
Thank you. Very good answer. So now let me ask you an unfair question. Previously, you've spent a lot of time around the importance of getting back to full employment and what is needed to get back to full employment. The unfair part of the question: which country is more important, China or the US?
Well, I didn't say, Abigail, to get back to full employment. I said to get to full employment.
That is true. Very, stand corrected.
One of my strong points in the second lecture was that we didn't have full employment.
Absolutely.
I think that's a mistake of our monetary policy. I think the Reserve Bank is responsible for 300,000 jobs, full-time equivalent jobs, not being there on average for 7 years. And amongst other things, that would have meant if we'd had all those people in work and earning income being taxed, Josh Frydenberg would have had one surplus before all of this happened. So I was talking about getting to full employment, not back. The international situation is very important. Economically, there's no doubt that what happens in China is more important than what happens in demand in the United States, in trade, in determining economic conditions in Australia. But for full employment, the country in which is most important in determining whether we have full employment is Australia, because it's policy that determines whether or not we have full employment.
Okay, great, thanks. And now I have a question of when is the book you're writing going to be available?
Well, I've had a big discussion with my publisher in the last week, and we were thinking of bringing it out in September, but the Treasurer is bringing down a budget on the 10th of October, and I thought it would look a little bit silly if there's a whole lot of things in that budget that talk about things that I talk about, and a book comes out after the. No, to put it to bed, it was going to come out just before, and that all makes it less relevant than it would be. So I'm going to have it all prepared, except for the last chapter, and I'll take into account the Treasurer's budget on October. Well, I think it's the second week of October. And within days of that, the press will run and the book will come out in the first half of November.
Wow, that's impressive. So, that's great. Okay, there is one last question before we wrap up. So we're going to get back to China. So China observers tend to identify China's rise as either taking its place in the existing global system or as trying to reshape the existing global system. Do you have a view on this?
China's success in the last 40 years has been within the existing system. within the system of open trade that has been very good for, I think, all of the countries of the world. Never in the world have we had the prosperity, the economic growth as we had between really from the end of the Second World War. And a major contributor to that was the system of open trade, with the GATT and the WTO playing major roles. So economically, China did very well out of that post-war system. It was that system that allowed unprecedentedly rapid economic growth in Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, other developing countries, Southeast Asia, a little bit later, then more and more countries around the world in the early 21st century, even a number of African countries, especially those that didn't have resource riches to corrupt their political systems. And so China's done very well out of that, and will seek to maintain elements of that system, out of which it's done very well. There are other elements of the global system which it is seeking to change. A lot of international institutions don't reflect the relative political and economic and strategic weight of different countries as they were 70 years ago, and China wants to change that. Other countries want to change it as well, and I think there are some things wrong. I think that in terms of the international relations and political cooperation and strategic systems, India's got an even bigger claim to saying that the realities of 70 years ago, which excluded it, for example, from the Security Council, are no longer appropriate. So China will want to change those things. But I think that there's widespread recognition in China of how much it's gained from the international trade and investment system as it's existed for the last 70 years. And at this stage, it will be wanting to preserve as much of that as it could.
Great, thank you. So this is going to conclude the Reset webinar series. All lectures are available online, and the link to the lectures have been posted in the chat function of this webinar if you look at the bottom of your screen. Ross, I would like to thank you for stepping up and creating these lectures. They have provided an important context of the past and a path forward during this turbulent period. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Abigail, for hosting it, and I hope you all enjoy the book in due course.
It's been a delight.